looking at today is we're exploring the issue of Black consciousness, a phenomenon that swept through South Africa in the 1970s. And I'm joined here today by Anna, Giovanna, and Heaven, who have all kindly agreed to take part and have this discussion about Black consciousness in South Africa. So I think the first thing we need to look at when looking at this issue is, what was the spark? What was the moment when Black consciousness really showed its strength as an ideology and as a movement? And I think that happened in 1976 in Soweto. So Giovanna, can you tell me a little bit more about what happened in 1976 in Soweto?
Yeah, so in 1976, there was a uprising in Soweto where children left schools and they went to the streets of Soweto to protest against the Bantu education system, and just to let out all their general frustrations and grievances about apartheid. And the Soweto uprising was really a turning point in South African politics. It represented the moment that the youth really gained their voice and the moment that the youth really understood their oppression under apartheid. And I guess from then on, from Soweto uprising on, the Black consciousness movement only strengthened and gained momentum from the uprising. So following the Soweto uprising, there was numerous of urban riots, urban protests that just demonstrated how gradually the African forces were gaining strength within South African society, and they were gaining more of a legitimacy.
What does Soweto stand for?
Southwest Township. So it's like abbreviated the first two letters of each word.
Excellent. Okay, so what was a township in South Africa?
So they were like, with the apartheid system, Africans weren't allowed to live in the cities, so they had to live on Bantustans, but most of the time, many of them still had to work in the cities. So commuting from the Bantustans to the cities every day was like tiring, and it was a lot of hard work. So many of them started to reside in these townships, which were illegal settlements on the like outskirts of the cities. So it was easier for them to commute to work.
Yeah, there was a lot of poverty in the townships, a lot of overcrowding, and just a lack of proper sanitation and access to healthcare and stuff like that.
Brilliant.
So it was like a slum, basically.
Yeah, good, like a shanty town, like a slum. So it shows the impracticality of apartheid then. So what was like the ultimate aim, the ultimate vision and end game of apartheid?
I mean, for the people that were experiencing the brunt of the regime, I think the end goal would have been for them to be able to freely live in the cities, like if they chose to, or reside in the Bantustans, but like for the Bantustans to be improved so that they were livable. Yeah, but I think different people would have had different aims.
True. So when Vivid talked about apartheid, what did apartheid literally mean? It's an Afrikaans word, but in English, what does it mean?
Apartness.
Apartness, good, separateness, right? So the end goal, the vision of apartheid was separate development. So to have white South Africa and black South Africa. So I think just the fact that these townships existed proved that just wasn't realistic, because obviously the African labour was quite a valuable resource to the South African economy because it was cheap labour, right? So you had an increased amount of people living in these townships. And as Giovanna pointed out, they were places of squalor, right? Places where it was very overcrowded and so forth. So what was it that made those school children in this township of Soweto, what was it that sparked their mobilization, that made them march out onto the streets and defy bullets, as Gerhard put it?
Well, in 1974, there was a change in legislation in the Bantu Education Act, in which said that half the subjects that they were being taught had to be taught in Afrikaans. And generally for the Africans, Afrikaans was the language of the oppressor. And so to be taught in a language that you didn't know, that was unfamiliar, and a language that was used to oppress you and to deem you inferior, it just brewed more frustrations in the youth, and it showed them that apartheid would never be fair, and apartheid would never allow them succeed what they could succeed.
Excellent. So that was like the catalyst, the spark that really pushed the children out of schools, because if you're learning in a language which isn't a familiar language or the first language that you speak at home, then you can't understand it properly. It's going to be even more difficult to unlock the limited education you had.
Yeah.
What else, like in terms of like longer term factors then? So if Afrikaans was the spark, what were the longer term causes in the Soweto uprisings?
Well, there was the decolonization of Mozambique and Angola.
Excellent.
And yeah, so there was a lot of Black power, Black consciousness movement within there as well. And so it was only creating more momentum and create more momentum for the Africans in South Africa.
Good. So yeah, so how did that create more momentum then? So you've got the liberation of countries around South Africa, which were white rule. So how does that create the momentum within South Africa as well?
I mean, the fact that like the oppressed in South Africa were seeing that others were able to rid themselves of their oppressors, I guess it kind of just sparked that fire in them that they wanted to get rid of it as well. And yeah, so students took matters into their own hands.
Yeah.
And I think the other things as well is you had a massive increase in the African population. And when you have a big increase and a big boom in a population, it means you have more young people in a country as well. So if you look at Soweto, half of its population were under 25. So it was a very young population. And then they started to feel like a dichotomy, a separation with their elders. What was their frustration towards people who were older than them, the young people in places like Soweto?
They just felt like that the elders like accepted the oppression and that they weren't doing enough against it. And it's like, you know, your oppressors only have as much power as you give them, because technically, as being the majority, you can rise up and unite against those oppressors, literally being the majority. And so they felt like they were being too complacent with the system and that they needed to actually be more defiant. And
so it's about creating a more radicalized youth. And these are children who are crammed into classrooms. So in Soweto, the class sizes were up to 70 children, people standing up, people sharing desks and things like that. So already you have a limited education, and even within that limited education, it's even worse, right? It's even more restricted than it should be. So why would you be so frustrated at the idea of having a limited education? What does education actually mean?
Empowerment.
Yeah, education is everything. It's like your pathway to your future, to life.
Yeah, education is the foundation. It shapes the way you think, it shapes the way you react, the way you express yourself. And the fact that Clark mentions that they had been educated to be stuck in an inferiority complex. They had been taught to be inferior. And so if you're being taught to inferior, how are you supposed to rise? How are you supposed to garner the power of your voice? And so I guess that's the power of education. It's giving you a voice.
If you read 1984, one of the bits that the author touches on is that the government is trying to limit language, because one of the big things that we have is words, right? So you're able to express yourself, you're able to communicate. If I'm feeling angry, but I have no word for angry, I am almost not angry because I'm not able to express that. And so one of the things you look for our history is you see that a lot of leaders, a lot of people who have risen up and been freedom fighters, a lot of people that have been leading in movements are people who have had an education, because they're eloquent, they can express themselves, they can see the wider picture, and also they can afford to almost put themselves on the line. Whereas people of lower classes or people who have been not given a proper education are not able to do so because they're not eloquent, they can't speak formally, they can't express ideas so well. And that's exactly the problem. The problem is that poverty puts you in a place where you can't get education, and therefore because you don't have education you can't express yourself, which means you're always going to be part of the oppression.
Brilliant. So a limited education is the oppression of the mind, isn't it? And if the mind is oppressed, then everything else will be oppressed around you. So that's a good lead on to Biko, actually, because Steve Biko was a very important figure in this period. And he's one of the last resistance leaders in South Africa who was actually educated before the Bantu Education Act came in. So he received his primary education before that. Why is that so important, actually, that he was educated before the Bantu Education Act?
So the Bantu Education Act was an act that implemented that all people had to be taught under government-run schools, and so missionary schools, which had been in it for a long time, the schools that taught African children, there were missionary schools like Catholic and all that. They were basically forced to close down, and so these schools taught. They were not perfect, but at least they taught a fuller curriculum, and it was more they benefited more from it than the government-run schools that literally taught Black children that they were inferior. They didn't teach them proper skills, very like minimally educated, whereas Biko actually got access to a better, fuller education that perhaps contributed to him being able to express himself in the future.
So what was the whole point of the Bantu Education Act then?
To create generations of unskilled labourers.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah. So it was about giving Africans the most basic education so they can just about operate machinery, basic literacy, basic numeracy, and then that's it. So fantastic. So it's about limiting Black education. So Anna, can you tell me a little bit more about Steve Biko and what was his role in this period?
Basically what matters is he went to university. He went to a white university to study medicine. And he was within white universities, non-whites. I'm going to refer, because he uses that term as well, although I have an issue with the term non-white. I don't like that term, but I'm just going to use it for now.
Why don't you?
Because it's like, because if you're non-something, that just oppresses you more. You can't be non-something. You have to be something. If I say you're non-something, I am oppressing you even more than if I was to say you are something. Because the idea that you're the opposite of something implies that you're not even good enough to be something is the most demeaning thing I can call human beings, that they're non-something.
Yes.
So the idea that they're non-whites, it's like,
yeah.
You're not even good enough to be called Black, Indian, Asian, whatever you are just not what you should be. But he uses that term a lot during his speech, and they use that term a lot, which shows that even when you are trying to liberate your mind, there's only so much you can go, because your foundations shape you so much that just simple language, you still use it. But anyway, so basically when he went to white university, he was in the non-white department, the National Organization for people of color. And he was very much against them. He went to a few meetings, but he realized that they were just literally white liberals that were quite literally going against what they stood for. What he basically said is a big hypocrisy, that you are saying you hate the system that you benefit from daily, and that you're saying that you're helping people that you are not giving a voice to.
Brilliant.
And so basically he thought that Black people had to fight for Black rights. If you are leading a Black movement, then it has to be Black leaders, it has to be Black people speaking and saying, this is what I'm going through, and it has to be them leading them. So he basically spoke for the idea of Black people need to lead this movement. Let's not listen to white liberals as much, and if at all. I feel like as a foundation, he just thought white people cannot be part of this movement, Black people need to be part of this movement, and we're going to lead it and not let white people speak for us.
African saves African.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think he has that awakening, doesn't he, when he's part of the student union movement, and there's the Black movement and the white movement, and the white movement are like, oh, don't worry, we're all inclusive. And then the Black part of the movement are told that they can't come into the Road campus and they can't take part in the national student union activities. And the white liberals are like, don't worry, we'll talk for you. You know, it's just unfortunate. And they're just kind of accepting the status quo. So I think to Biko, he felt that with white help and white support and white people in the movement, it comes very much on this sort of position that the white people are almost like a white savior, and they would Black people would have an obligation to them, and this idea of multiracialism or non-racialism, or what we'd call today as colorblindness. So what are your thoughts then, because I remember Heaven and Giovanni, you were talking before about the book that he wrote, not a book, sorry, an article that he wrote. So he writes a collection, his articles are kind of collected together in a book called I Write What I Like. And he talks in one of those articles about black souls with white skins. What does that mean, black souls with white skins?
Essentially, white liberals.
Yeah, good. So white liberals, yeah?
Yeah. I mean, the idea that, like Anna was saying, like you wanna help the Africans, you wanna be on their side, yet you still have your white privilege, and you accept that privilege, and you make use of that privilege, and you take advantage of that privilege whilst supporting a cause that denies you privilege over the Africans.
Excellent, right? And I think to Biko, that's one of the things that he's always quite uncomfortable with. Like, with white people in the movement, are they going to give up their privilege? Are they going to agree to the right course to come to independence and freedom for black people? Or is it going to be something on their terms? So they might not, as Biko said, they might not vote for the National Party, but they most certainly benefit from the National Party. So when we're thinking about white liberals and the struggle against apartheid, because they say that they're in the struggle too, right? What would a solution against apartheid be to white liberals?
Cooperation.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess white liberals were hoping for the outcome that came. Really, like with Mandela becoming president, the way that he dealt with apartheid was, I guess, the outcome that white liberals were hoping for, and that's why they supported him so much, because no one was really held accountable for their actions during the oppression of Africans and coloureds and Asians. And there was never a redistribution of land or a redistribution of wealth, and white people are still at the top in South Africa to this day. Like, it's how many years after, and they're still at the top. So I guess they got what they wanted in the end.
That's true. And also the idea that there was like no war, there was no civil war, and there was no violence. Well, there was violence, obviously, we do know that there was violence, but there was no violence against, like, as in the idea of like civil war.
There was no massacre of white people.
Yeah, basically that's a perfect way of phrasing it. Yeah.
But liberal democracy was installed in South Africa as a result, right? So that's basically one man, one vote. So everybody has the same rights to vote and so forth. And I think Biko says something quite interesting in that he kind of acknowledges that, you know, it's not about just adopting Western ideals, and whatever a new South Africa is, it should be built on African values rather than on European values. And I think you've put it perfectly there, Heaven. It's still a liberal capitalist democracy, isn't it? And has there been justice in South Africa? So they attempted to do that with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, but there's a lot of issues with that, and maybe that could be a later podcast that we do. We can look into that a bit more and discuss the limits of that. So another thing then, so that Anna's picked up on already, is this idea of non-racialism or colourblindness. What, like, even just in a contemporary conversation, so talking about with South Africa, but talking about it today, what do you think about this idea of I don't see colour? What's wrong with that?
I mean, obviously every poor person does suffer, but if you're a white poor person, you still have the privilege of being white. But if you're a black poor person, you're immediately put under the white poor person. So even though you guys are both poor, so you have the same class, the race is what divides you and what puts you in a hierarchy still.
But I think it's definitely a big part of, like, I don't see color, but it's like society sees color. And I think the least you can do, you know, as a white person, for me at least, is recognize your white privilege, obviously, and just say you do have it. And second of all is understand that maybe you don't see color. Like, for example, if I see a black person, the first thing I think is, oh, they're a black person, obviously, no. But society does see color, so that you have to also acknowledge that and help people by being an ally, and not by giving them a hand up, but actually just giving them a voice. Like, just let them speak their struggle and don't interrupt.
The most dangerous thing about people claiming to be colorblind is the fact that, like, by saying you're colorblind, you're saying that you're choosing not to acknowledge a person's color, and that in itself, it's like you're blaming a person's color for the issue of racism. Racism doesn't exist because there are people of different races and people of different ethnicities. Racism exists because there are people that are ignorant enough to believe that there's a hierarchy based off of those ethnicities and based off of those races.
Yeah, so how could we even begin to tackle racism in society if we don't look at our own implicit biases as well? And I think in terms of having justice in society, the first thing we need to do, and the first people we need to hold to account, are ourselves and our own biases and what we think about different races and the way that we treat people differently because of that. We might not realize we're doing it, but the only way that we can stop with treating people different and stop with prejudice is by acknowledging that we have those thoughts and then moving away from those thoughts. It's not about pretending those thoughts never existed in the first place. So race is a construct, and it's something that has been built on for hundreds of years, and we can't just suddenly go, oh, slavery's over now, racism is done. We've had the Civil Rights Act, we've had the Race Relations Act in the UK, there's no such thing anymore. And the other thing as well is when you think about I don't see colour, what is that well-meaning white person saying? What are they saying they see you as?
White.
As white, yeah? So they see you, look, you're just like me. I'm not seeing you as anyone different. I'm not seeing you as different. I'm going to treat you just like I treat a white person. So it's still that whole otherness that Biko really identified quite well and Anna spoke about earlier. So the other of the idea of being white and non-white. So we've seen Simone de Beauvoir talking about that in The Second Sex when she talks about this in a gendered way, right? What does it mean to be the other?
The fact that non-white means the absence of being something, then you're literally saying that person doesn't have dignity because they're not white. And so it just, the whole dehumanizing factor of apartheid.
And I think that's what was so powerful about Steve Biko, is he was able to kind of look at the society at the time and interpret it. And he was so crucial because he was able to articulate the response to oppression in South Africa at that time. And his ideas, the Black consciousness ideas, were able to spread across South Africa. And quite importantly, the government tried to react. So Vorster was the prime minister at the time, and he tried to react and tried to arrest all leaders. So Biko himself was banned. He was never able to be with more than one person at a time. But the Black consciousness carried on. So what actually is Black consciousness then? And why was it even called Black consciousness? So Heaven, tell us a little bit about Black consciousness.
So Black consciousness was a movement spearheaded by Biko. And it was, I think a lot of people perceived it to be like a threat to the ANC, to what the ANC stood for. But I think they were both equally significant in their own rights because they both had different aims. So with Black consciousness, it was about kind of getting rid of the psychological chains of oppression that was placed on the minds of Black people in South Africa. And I think what's so powerful about the title of the movement, Black consciousness, with Biko, he defines being Black as being anyone of any racial group that was denied basic civil rights under the apartheid regime. And so I think it links back to, like, in America, when people were referred to as being Black, it was more of a political thing. If you were Black, it didn't mean that you were necessarily of African descent. And so I think naming the movement under that, it's like it gives people a sense of solidarity. They're all fighting under the same thing, like they're all fighting against the same aim.
It's unifying, and I think that's such a good point. He doesn't call it African consciousness, even though there was Africanism, right? But he doesn't call it African consciousness. He doesn't call it Xhosa consciousness either. So exactly as Heaven said, the idea of the word Black, it's a political term. It's not referring to skin color, right? It's talking anybody who is oppressed can be considered to be Black. And that was actually something, so like you said, in America, but it was also a term used in Britain to include anybody who was oppressed as well. So you had the Grunwick Strike, which were South Asian immigrants fighting for rights and to be recognized by trade unions in Dollis Hill. And they classified themselves as black as well, even though they were South Asian. And then that just meant that there was unity, and it was about, let's not be divided by different ethnicities and nationalities, but let's all come together against our common oppressor and rally behind each other, which was a really beautiful moment in British history. And again in South Africa as well. Why actually was it so important that this wasn't just an African movement? Why was it important that Khalids and Indians were included as well?
They were all fighting against the same aim and the same oppressor, and so all of them being kind of like grouped under that same term of being black was just another way of uniting them together in their oppression.
Yeah, and I think that apartheid, meaning apartness, means that what they literally construct was a hierarchy system where it wasn't just white and black, it was Indians and coloureds, and so they had a little bit more privilege than black people did, and this was to unite, because they kind of preyed on the human idea that if I am a little bit better off than someone else, then I'm gonna not identify myself with them, and I'm not gonna unite myself with them because I'm a little bit better. And I think capitalism is a little bit like that as well. But going back to the National Party, not talking about capitalism, it's the idea that because they thought that because Indian people and coloureds, or mixed race people, were a little bit better off than black Africans, that they wouldn't recognize their similarities in oppression, and that they would see each other as a little bit better, and then therefore aspire more to be white than aspire to unite with the black people. And so by creating this unifying title and this unifying movement where anyone who is struggling can fight for, it was completely against apartheid, and it was extremely dangerous for the apartheid system because it clearly defied the hierarchy they have been trying to build since 1948.
In my coursework, I wrote this sentence, and I think it links well to the fact that it was Africans, coloured, and Indians. I said that the expansion of demographics represented the unification of a civil society in which emancipation was the ultimate consensus. And from when I was writing that, what I thought was that the ultimate aim of them was to be liberated. And if you have the same goal and if you have the same aim, why not join forces to only strengthen your cause and strengthen your struggle? So I think that's what made it more powerful, the fact that it wasn't tribal, it wasn't just African, but it was all those that were oppressed.
Brilliant. And how did the how did the National Party, consistently try to undermine that unity and that solidarity? What sort of
Divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer? How? How did they try to divide and conquer?
I mean, with the Bantustans, they scattered the Bantustans across the nation, making it hard for people to communicate, making it hard for protests to happen.
They also named them, like they gave different Bantustans different names, which essentially gave the Africans different identities, which, I mean, it worked to a certain extent. Like when you think of Buthelezi, he fought for Zulu independence, and
so really playing in on tribal differences and making them kind of trying to separate them geographically but culturally as well, by allowing them to kind of have their own flags and that sort of thing, so being separate from the other African tribes in South Africa. What else? So that's really good about how the Africans were divided, but how did they try to stop coloureds or discourage coloureds and Indians from working with Africans?
Wouldn't they give them more opportunities?
Particularly in the 80s, actually. What did they all have?
Parliament, tricameral parliament. There was the African chamber, the Indian chamber, and there was the coloured chamber, and the Indians and the coloured chamber had more representatives than the Africans, which immediately showed the political difference in power. Even though it wasn't significant, it was still a difference in power. And I guess it was them trying to enforce the idea that you guys aren't good enough for them, but you're still not good enough for us. But in the middle stage, so we'll keep you there, but don't work with them because they're not worth your time. That kind of rhetoric.
Excellent. So by trying to bring to some extent, a limited extent, the Coloureds and the Indians into the white parliament, even though it was less power, it was a way to try and legitimize apartheid for the Western world, but also to try and stop them joining in on that struggle with Africans, which I think the boycott movements were quite successful in trying to stop that from happening. And the focus on that again was education and about trying to liberate people's minds. And going back to this idea of Black consciousness then, Biko says that the Black man in himself has developed a certain state of alienation. What does that mean? How were Black people in South Africa alienated? What did he mean by that?
I'm just going to make reference to something that Clark said. So like Giovanna mentioned earlier how Blacks suffered from an inferiority complex, which was as a result of 300 years of deliberate oppression, denigration, and derision. But Clark also, he spoke about how the Black man would reject himself because he attached the meaning of white to being all that is good. Yeah. And so because he's non-white, literally, he doesn't realize his potential and what he deserves, and it puts him in a position where he doesn't feel as though he needs to be struggling because he doesn't realize the fact. Yeah, no, he's began to believe that he's less.
Yeah,
and I think the psychological impact of oppression is something that's not often talked about. It's not just about poverty, suffering in that way, or about literally being beaten or harassed by policemen whenever they felt like it. It's the psychological impact of quite literally believing that you are not as good as another race of people, which is so hard to, especially if you're white, it's so hard to like think about because you've never been told that in your life. And so to place yourself or to try to comprehend how someone could believe that although they have the same feelings, the same perhaps the same even morals in terms of like common decency as a white person would, that they still believe that they would be inferior is such a horrible part of oppression. Like for me, it's probably the most terrifying part of like learning about race and all that. Is just the idea that they really actually started believing that they were lesser. But it is something that you're able to accomplish when you just put enough enough of that out there, like enough of that information, that propaganda and all that.
Yeah. Go on, Heaven.
I was just going to say how the psychological damage is still like very much prevalent today. Like even when you look at like beauty standards, which may seem fickle, but it's very like deep running and it's deep rooted. Like a lot of young Afro-Caribbean girls won't think that they're beautiful because European beauty standards are the ones that are like idolized, I guess. And yeah, it's still an issue that's very much prevalent. So
it creates this alienation, this self-hatred. So exactly what you're saying, it's not fickle to be talking about beauty standards because that is your part of self-love, isn't it? About how you view yourself, and the way you view yourself and the way you value yourself is based on the values that society puts on you. So if you have that self-hatred in the way that you look and try to drastically change that, that's quite damaging. And if you think to be Black is not to be beautiful, that's going to have long-term effects. And if you're also thinking about, especially in places like Soweto, in those different townships, they live in squalor and then they go and they work in Johannesburg and they get to see these massive houses, they get to see the suburbs and those sorts of places, and they think white people get that, we don't get that. And then that helps feed into this idea of self-hatred. And if you have self-hatred, you feel that you don't deserve to have freedom. And if you feel like you don't deserve to have freedom, you accept where you are and you don't fight, you don't rebel. So the first step to societal change in South Africa is the mental revolution. It's a revolution inside the mind, which is through education and through the promotion of self-love. So it takes shape then in South Africa when we're looking at the Soweto uprisings, and then that spreads throughout South Africa. So why couldn't it be stopped when Vorster tried to arrest all leaders that had anything to do with Black consciousness? Why did that not just see an end to it in the same way that Sharpeville saw the arrest of the leaders of the PAT and the ANC, and then there was very little response to that then? Why didn't that happen?
I mean, it's the power of an idea. Once you've developed an idea and you've understood the power of the idea, then it's hard to stop someone from going on with it and stop someone from spreading it on through generations.
Excellent.
Yeah. You can't kill an idea. Once an idea is born, it lives on, as long as you're able to publicize it.
Brilliant. Yeah. So you can't kill an idea, you can't arrest an idea. So
It becomes a way of life also.
Yeah.
I mean, Black consciousness was something that fought for Black pride and awareness of your oppression and a voice, agency. And once you understood all of that and once you accepted it, it became your way of life. And it's really hard to change a way of life. It's hard to change the way you express yourself.
And also, like, race as an idea is extremely fickle. Like, you know, once you start like shedding away this layer of inferiority, you start actually understanding that doesn't make a lot of sense, and I think it becomes kind of like a click. It's almost like a snap or a click. Like, it's once someone understands that actually they're not inferior, it's almost like everything starts making sense. And so I think it would be very hard to stop that chain of events.